Hello everyone, welcome to the Music Masterclass. My name is Marc Sabatella with Mastering MuseScore, and this is how I spend my Thursday mornings. Could be afternoon or evening for you, but we look at some music. We take some of the music that you all have created and submitted, and I give my comments and feedback, and maybe show you a couple things along the way. This is a service is brought to you by the Mastering MuseScore School, and I highly encourage you to check it out. Check out all the courses that I offer and so forth. That's my commercial announcement, and I have to remember to go in here and actually paste that link into the chat. So give me a moment to get on that. But yeah, I've got a couple of pieces queued up to talk about, and something that just came up in conversation, like really 2 or 3 times recently, that I want to be sure to talk about a little bit, and that's where I'm going to start after I get this link in there, because most of you already know about this and you're already there, but for those of you who don't, this is where are things like my MuseScore course, my harmony course, the counterpoint course I've been working on, etc. So definitely highly recommended. Okay, so the thing that came up in conversation had to do with a particular case, and I'm going to show you Sam's version first. So this came up during my office hours on Tuesdays, and it was an interesting example of some voicings in a big band arrangement, and it went. Here's how it originally worked here. I'll play the original version, and then I'll kind of show you some of the reductions that Sam did, talk about the issues that came up, and then show how it came up again. So let's hear. It's just 2 bars long. All right, so what's going on is this chord right here is a chord. It's basically an F minor chord, and the melody has in it the melody is in this case it's the, if I'm looking at the keys right, yeah, it's the 4th of the chord, or the 11th going to the 3rd of the chord. And then we have a B flat chord, and it's the 6th going to the 5th. Then, in a piece that Colleen wrote, and we're going to look at some more of her music in a moment, we have something else going on. We have basically an E minor chord here. I should start at the beginning so it doesn't sound so strange. And I am going to take this bass clarinet part down an octave. We talked about that over on the community. Now, it'd be really nice if a bass clarinet really had that note, but they usually don't. At least the ones I've played only usually go down to an E flat. I know some go down to D. So what's happening here is we have an E minor chord, an E7 chord. There's an E7 chord in which the melody is the root going to the 9th. So what do these things have in common? What they have in common is that in all 3 of these cases, so here we had a minor chord with the 4th going to the 3rd, a dominant chord with the 6th going to the 5th. Let me start with a tie. And then we had a dominant chord with root going to the 2nd or 9th. So the thing that they all have in common is, at some level, the melody is not moving. What do I mean by that? Obviously the melody's moving. 4 moving to 3, right? 6 moving to 5, 1 moving to 2. Yes, in a literal sense, they're all moving. But literally they're moving. But we have, in the world of harmonizing melodies like this, and so these are, jazz type arrangements here, but this doesn't just go for jazz, it's just that it comes up all the time in jazz arranging. When we're harmonizing what we call a thickened chord, where you have every note of the melody harmonized with a chord like that. If the melody moves in thirds, then you can have a different voicing every time the melody moves. If the melody had not done that, if it had just moved directly from the E to the G sharp, then every note in the chord would also get to move up. All your voices would get to move. When the melody moves in steps, you have a bit of a problem, because now you're going to have a case where you've voiced your chord really nicely with the E on top, the root on top, and then the root goes up, the melody goes up to the ninth, and you're like, well, what can I do underneath that now? The chord hasn't changed. And so it's a constant struggle every time this ever comes up, when you have a melody going from scale degree 1 to scale degree 2, or not even scale degree, but just moving by step. So if it's moving from the root of the chord to the ninth of the chord, or the third to the fourth, or the fifth to the sixth, or vice versa, any stepwise motion like that, you're going to have these cases where, if you're not careful, or you end up with repeated notes. And sometimes you have no choice but to have repeated notes. So in this example here, you can see that the melody is going B flat to A flat, and the alto sax part moved from G to F. That's actually the ninth of the chord to the root of the chord. But the tenor is stuck just playing E flat twice, because there was nothing else for it to do. And the trombone is stuck playing C twice. There was nothing else for it to do. This happens over and over. If the melody moves by step and you want to keep the same chord, then you end up having these repeated notes in the parts. And repeated notes aren't the end of the world, especially at that kind of tempo. But if you're writing a piece that goes like this, I'll do it just with a nice C chord here, and let me add a couple staves here. Actually, I'm just going to write this like for a string quartet, so we can see it in that form. Chamber string quartet. All right. So if I'm writing this and I'm writing my melody, and then I'm harmonizing that with, just a plain triad underneath that. I'm going to have a G underneath there, and I'm going to have an E here, and a C in the cello. I'll put it down here. And then you look at, well, what am I going to do with the D? I'm not sure. So I skip the D, and I come to my E, and I'm like, okay, well, underneath that, if I still want it to be a C chord, I put a C there, and I put a G here, and I still have my C here, because I don't know what else I'm doing in the bass yet. But the question is, what do we do in the middle? What do we do with beat 2? What do we do with beat 2? If we want it to still be the C chord, well, I still need my E, and I don't know about you, but most of us don't read alto clef very well, so I'm just going to change that to treble clef transposed an octave. So this is E. If I want it to still sound like a C chord, I kind of have to do this. I kind of have to repeat the E and the G if I want it to still sound like a C chord. So this is an ongoing problem. Every time the melody moves by steps, you have some version of the same problem. So there are a couple of kind of well-known solutions to that problem. So one of the solutions is cheating a little bit, but it's okay. And that's just switch these two voices. Let this violin have the E, and let the viola have the G. And now no one is repeating a note. Unfortunately, the viola has to repeat a note right after that, so it's only a partial solution. It's out of the frying pan into the fire a little bit. But sometimes that works, because maybe the chord was going to change when we reach the E. Maybe the chord was going to change, I don't know, to an A minor chord. In fact, let's do that. Let's change this to an A minor chord. So instead of a G here, I'm going to want an A. There we go. So now I have... So that kind of solved the problem by having those two voices change notes. It did mean someone's going to have a pretty big leap to get back to where they belong. It was supposed to be a relatively small leap from G to C. Now they've got a bigger leap because I just gave the violin to the viola's note, which was lower. So that idea of exchanging two notes to avoid the repetition is one solution. And by the way, the reason repetition is an issue is it's not at a slow tempo. It sounds a little dull. It sounds a little boring to have that repeated note while the melody changes in this type of texture. But if it's at a faster tempo and you're doing this in eighth notes, wind instruments, and so this comes up all the time in jazz writing for like big band, trumpet, trombone, saxophones, especially for the trumpets and the saxophones, they're going to want to play these eighth notes. They're going to want to slur them, where you're just blowing air in one stream without tonguing every note individually and then using your fingers to indicate the notes, to play the notes. And you can't slur a repeated note. If you've got two G's in a row, you're going to have to use your tongue to play the second G. And so you're playing this line, and it's all eighth notes, and you'd love to be able to just do it in one breath, moving your fingers, slurring it. But if there's a repeated note, that messes it up. And it messes up your ability to play it, messes up the sound, because the tongue note is going to sound different also. So, that is the basic issue with the repeated note. It also can sound interesting. So Colleen's asking, can I use an A here and call this C6? Well, I possibly could, although now that the melody has left, the melody is on the D, there's very little C chord left here. It's actually a nice sound. This is kind of a chordal voicing. We have a D, A, and G. So those are kind of spaced in fourths. D, if you rearrange that in the right order, I guess A on the bottom, right? A on the bottom, D above that, G above that would all be fourths. But there's no third in this chord, right? So it kind of works here, and that's a solution. So that is a possible solution. But the more common solution is to use passing tones, passing chords, I should say. So instead of, like, let's say we actually did want to keep this a C chord, because that's going to make my point a little better. If instead of, and then I want to come up to here, what I'm going to want to do is instead of having C, 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 I'm going to want to go C, G, C. I'm going to want to suggest a G chord. So I can put in the notes of a G chord, or in particular, maybe a G7 chord. Like this. So this alternating 1, 5, 1, and you can do that all the way up the scale. I can do that again. And then here, let's see, coming down, that'll be a D, and then coming down here, that's a G, and then a B. And then over here, that's an E, and that's a C, and back to C here. So that technique, alternating the chord you're actually on with its own dominant, is a typical way of doing this. Now, realistically, we don't typically voice this in a jazz context as an actual dominant seventh with the root in the bass. We use passing diminished chords to give us maybe some slightly more interesting, smoother voice leading. So instead of, I'm just going to voice it this way for now. That voicing I wouldn't have used, but you get the idea. It's now a diminished chord. And probably what I'll do is increase the spacing here. Let this one have the A flat, this one have the F, and let this one have the B. So something more like that. And then the same thing when I get up here. Maybe instead of giving this guy the B, I'm going to give him or her the A flat, and again keep the B down here. So that type of approach of alternating the actual chord tone with a passing diminished chord or a dominant chord there is the typical way of solving this sort of problem, of creating the sense of motion. When you have a melody line in which several notes in a row are all from the same chord, that's how you solve the problem. So going back to Autumn Leaves, instead of having this F sharp harmonized with just more, that's basically still an E7 chord, I'm going to harmonize that using the diminished chord, basically a half step below. Like if you look at my example there, my example showed, where's my example? Here's my example. My example, the diminished chord is a half step below the root. C, B diminished, C, B diminished, C, right? So that, I'm going to go E and then D sharp diminished, and then back to E minor, or back to E. So I got my F sharp here. I'm going to make this be a D sharp, and let this be an A. So now I have, why does that not sound like a diminished chord? It probably is a diminished chord, and my ear's just hearing it funny. It's just the spacing of the notes. Yeah, it's a diminished chord. It's just that there's a big leap, a big jump in register between these clarinets. In fact, I think overall it might be better if I took that third clarinet part up an octave. Yeah, so now let's just hear this line. That line is that sound. That is the sound that we just heard in my example, transposed to your example. That is this. That is that exact thing, voiced ever so slightly differently in the key of E. Or in the key of E, this is an E7 chord. So let's hear that in context. So that's how that sound goes. Yeah, that is a typical technique, and it solves that problem. Because this melody has to happen every single measure. Every other measure is going to have 1, 2, 3 in the melody. Then we're going to have a D chord with 1, 1, 2, 3. So the same exact idea here. We're going to have the same issue potentially of, and you have the repeated note there, A. If instead of trying to keep the D chord, if instead I made this be a diminished chord, that would work. And, I could voice it differently. I could make this be the B flat instead. Whoa. Oh, that's a G sharp. Sorry, I want a G natural. Let me go back to my C sharp then. All right, so every single measure has the same thing. The way this song is constructed, every one of those pickups is 1, 2, 3 on of whatever the chord is at the moment, and then the chords all follow the circle of fifths. It's a very sequence-oriented piece. So anyhow, that solves that issue. So that's a good technique to know. This idea when you're harmonizing a line that's essentially scalar and the chord doesn't change, because like if it's an eighth note line, probably the chord is not meant to change every eighth note, maybe not even every beat. It might be 2 beats, might even be 4 beats of a single chord with all these eighth notes over it. That technique of those alternating diminished chords there allows you to harmonize each note of that melody differently, but in a way that makes sense. You just get that sense of 1 7 1 7 1 7 1 7 1, and it sounds good. So anyhow, that's a nice little trick that came up twice this week, so I figured I would talk about it. All right, so the next thing that I want to do is, there'll probably be some questions popping in here. Oh yes, and I see a comment there about call and response, and yeah, call and response is a great thing. If during the whole note, the bass, instead of playing if it went B, C, D, D sharp, E, something like that, and then again here. This is, in fact, this came up for me when I was working on my counterpoint class. Maybe I don't, maybe I put in a C sharp here and leap up to there to make it fit the chord better. Something like that. This song is, as I said, it's basically a sequence following the circle of fifths, and so you can basically do that same pattern over and over again. The melodies are going to go ba-do-da-ba, ba-do-da-dum, ba-do-da-da-da, ba-do-da-dum. It's got the same sequence going down in steps. The bass is going to have boo-da-dum. Maybe I'll do the same trick here to make the sequence more obvious. Boo-da-da-da-dum, boo-da-da-da-dum, boo-da-da-da-dum. Right? It'll be the same sequence going down in steps. Whenever you have a piece in circle of fifths like that, you can get that motion going back and forth between the voices and create sequences like that. This is an important part of writing fugues. And before I do move on, I got to show you what I've been working on lately. I have written, I can't even count how many little stretto sections of fugues. And just tons of little strettos so I can get practice in just the whole idea of, I don't even know which one I like. Some of them I like more than others, but I just wrote a million of them. Lines passing back and forth between voices as a way of modulating, because that's really what this thing is doing. Your Autumn Leaves is moving around the circle of fifths, going from a B chord to an E chord to an A chord to a D chord. And if you think about it, you're landing on an A. And then it just keeps modulating is my point here. It's gone down from an E down to a D. It's not literally changing keys, but the thing is moving down in steps. If you work your sequence the way you would in a fugue, you will actually use that as a way of changing keys, and that's an important part of fugue writing. So yeah, and as I was putting it together, I was like, oh yeah, Autumn Leaves is like the classic example of a piece that's set up to actually allow for that sort of thing. Okay, so all right. So what I'm going to do is bring up something different here now. So Joanne has been working on a series of pieces. So I'm going to bring up both of these two, and hopefully get to talk about them both. And I'll skip this one first because I want to talk about Joanne's first. So this is Joanne's piece that's still kind of in progress, but it's in really good shape. And so I am going to play it for you, and we're just going to listen to the whole piece. It's I forget how long it is, to be honest, but let me just play. It's 2.5 minutes. All right, so let's hear the piece and then talk about some of the stuff that's going on in it. So, this is Joanne's How Beautiful Upon the Mountains, based on Isaiah, what is it, 50, 52, verse 7. So, all right, lovely, lovely song, Joanne. I think that's it's a really really nice melody. It's just harmonized, perfectly for the type of melody it is. It's working really well. And I know we talked in office hours a little bit about the uh, um, what am I saying? We talked a little bit about some of the technical issues of setting the score up, and I remember there was one question you asked that I didn't get to address, and that is, so you've got this tenor part, and you've got it written in treble clef with the optional 8 VB on it, which is all good. But I think you had asked at one point about wanting that staff below the other one. So it's Edit, Instruments. And then all you got to do is select that staff right here, the one that says voice, and yeah, select the instrument, not the staff. Select the instrument here and hit the down arrow. Boom. And now it's below the soprano. Now, in point of fact, this is really just currently exactly the same part. It's been copy and pasted, so I assume eventually there's going to be something done to make some other things happen there, because I know you said it's a work in progress. So the what I want to mention here is you can see some of this repeated note stuff happening here, but the melody has repeated notes here, and so it's expected that the harmony might also have repeated notes. It's not a problem at all to have repeated notes, but because I was just talking about that, I want to point out some places where you're doing exactly the right sorts of things here. Right? This is a C chord, and so you've moved the melody up to F sharp. Rather than keeping a C in that harmony part, you're having the harmony part move as well. So this is like a two-voice version of that same issue. If you were writing this in four parts, like four actual different parts, I think you would find that what you're doing here, this is basically suggesting a little bit of a D chord here, F sharp and D, and it works because you're only got two parts. But I think if you actually voiced the whole triad in there, you wouldn't like that as much. And you might want to try another technique like using the diminished chord idea, except it's not going to work here so well. Well, if I voice this, if I call this a C diminished chord, because that F sharp, F sharp doesn't fit B diminished, so that technique would not have worked. But you're in any case, you're doing the kind of thing that's necessary of implying a passing chord here. But I would say there's some missed opportunities, like right here. Instead of repeating the C and D underneath that G, we could have a similar thing going here of thinking about what chord we could fill it with better. And one possibility is if I thought of that as instead of a D chord, think of it as an A minor chord. So if you've got a major chord, like this is the 5 chord, D is the 5 chord, so what I'm really doing is putting the 2 chord in there. I'm putting in a little quick 2-5. So all I'm going to do is change the D to E everywhere, and just hear that measure again. So by having that E there, you're really doing the same thing, or I'm doing the same thing you had in the previous measure, having basically parallel thirds on top. But what it's doing is it's suggesting an A minor chord. And you say, well, I don't hear A minor. Well, there is an A in the bass there. But if I also change that bass note from C down to A, so that the bass, because that third note was repeating a C. So if I take it down to A, then all the voices get to move. Now, is it important that all the voices move? No, not necessarily. But since I'm talking about that subject, I thought I would bring it up because it seems potentially useful. Same thing right here. Now, when you only have two voices, and here's where something Humble New Music was asking about on the community just today, isn't writing two voices in some sense easier than writing for four? Well, yes, it's easier if you don't need it to tell the whole harmonic story. So if you've got enough else going on contrapuntally and so forth, yes. But if you just have two voices, two actual human voices singing a melody in harmony like that, two voices won't tell the whole harmonic story, but we've got piano accompaniment. So what I might want to do here is use parallel sixths. Whoops, wrong note. Something like this. So let me actually just solo the voice so we can just, oops, that's the wrong window. I want mixer, and I want to solo the voice. Right, so that type of sound, those parallel sixths, every time you have parallel thirds or parallel sixths, it's as if we're doing that whole thickened line thing I was talking about, that I showed with Autumn Leaves, but that is a technique that we think about when we actually have more than two voices. If you only have two voices, or four voices but they're doubling each other, then you don't need to think about the actual chords. You can just use parallel thirds or parallel sixths, and it gives you essentially the same exact result. So that's something you could definitely be thinking about. So yeah, I would say alto parts are often boring, but it's worth looking at alto parts in this type of context, especially when you have moving lines like this. I think you'll find most alto parts don't just repeat one pitch four times. I say most don't. There is a certain subgenre of like, what is it called? Is it shaker music? I forget. There was a certain kind of early American Christian music hymn type of sound that did rely on repeated notes with a melody moving against it as part of that sound. I think it's Shaker songs that do that, but I'm not the musicologist to tell you. But some subgenre of early American hymn arrangements that do that. But generally speaking, yes, the alto part is more restricted in range and will have a few more repeated notes, but not as many as what we're looking at here. So you might want to look at least some of those sorts of things. I'm going to undo all those changes because, those are just some suggestions. One other place that I want to call attention to here is a place that I actually called attention to when I played this piece briefly last time, because I thought it was interesting, and I still do, right here. So, what's happening here you have a B in the melody over your D chord, right? And you're voicing the D chord in a way where there's not actually a D even present in the chord, right? The bass has an F sharp, and the voicing on top, C, F sharp, and B, is actually suggesting, the comment I made last time is that turns out to be a chordal voicing, and I was talking about chordal voicings last time, and so it jumped out at me. What's jumping out at me now is I feel like conceptually this isn't really a D chord at all. In other words, because I don't hear the D in the bass, I'm going to put a D in the bass just so we can hear it. And I want to hear it this way. And that's fine, that chord works. But I think with your original bass note of F sharp, here's what I think is going on. I think your brain internally was not hearing a D chord. I think you were hearing a B chord, or a D sharp diminished chord, which is largely the same thing. So all I'm going to do to make that happen is change this C here for a second to a D sharp. Okay, so now we're going to have basically a very clear, and I'll add that same D sharp here. Let's hear this now. Now, the only reason I might not want to do that is the melody does have that D at the end of the measure. So I'm not necessarily saying there is a sort of a mismatch between the D sharp and the D, so you might be better off without it. But as far as labeling the chord, it still might be the case that labeling this as a diminished chord could be smarter, and maybe calling it F sharp diminished would be smarter. I don't know, but there is a sense in which the D is, I think there's a reason why it's kind of voiced the way it is. I think in your brain you weren't necessarily hearing a full-on D chord, and that's why you voiced it the way you did, and perhaps calling it something could be something different. Yeah, and so calling it, you call it, if you say there's a sixth in it, that's true, but there's also a seventh in it, and functionally this is it is the 5 chord. Whether you put the seventh in it in your voicing, it's functionally a seventh. It's much more to the point to call it D7 and let the sixth just be a non-chord tone. That's really much more in keeping with what chord symbols are used for than notating as a sixth and hope people just think about adding a seventh. So the point of the chord symbol is to note the function of the chord, and this is the 5 chord. Notating it as D7 would make sense, and it's perfectly fine for there to be B's in that chord. Now, the other possibility is that I called it B major, but if we call it B minor, that could be okay too. And now it's just diatonic. I put the D sharp in it because I really wanted it to be there to get to the E minor, to help tonicize the E minor. The D sharp would be the leading tone in E minor. But since your melody has the D, I think maybe thinking of this as a B minor chord with an F sharp in the bass is maybe the way to go. I don't know. But what the C actually did for you was give the illusion of the B chord as well as, or at least of the diminished chord. It gave the illusion of a D sharp diminished chord, because a D sharp diminished would have that C. So anyhow, it's an interesting chord. I don't have an answer for, well, this is, what it should be or anything like that, and it's your piece. But I do want to point out that the way you have this voiced here is quite dissonant. Not necessarily in an unpleasant way, but there might be another, I can't get inside your head to understand what you're actually hearing, but my guess is in your head you're hearing something slightly different from that sound. And so I'm trying to feed you some ideas of what you might be hearing and what might allow this to have more of the sound that you're looking for. Maybe it's just a question of adding the D. Maybe that helps, just giving it a D so it's got an explicit D so that we can understand the D chord better. Maybe that's all it needs. Maybe that's the right answer. There's no right, there's no wrong, but yeah, anyhow, that is something to think about, because there's something going on in the chord as you had it that feels a little more dissonant than I think you had in your mind, especially given that the lyric is peace at that point. All right, so I'm going to skip around to some other little things that I thought were interesting in here. Here's where you actually did the D6 to D7. And actually here I have another piece of advice. There's nothing wrong with the D6 there, but when you have that sixth in the melody, I'll tell you what I'm hearing. What I'm hearing in my head is 1-6-4. I'm going to change that to a G chord in second inversion. So this sound here, it's G chord with a D in the bass, followed by D7. Total classical 1-6-4, 5 to 1. And then you get more moving voices, because the way you originally had it, that middle voice stayed on F sharp, and what the 1-6-4 does is gives you an additional moving voice, which is always nice to just have that additional moving voice, especially because the cadence gets delayed that much more by another beat. So that otherwise it would have been in a lot of F sharp in a row. So I would think about using that G in there. As one other comment, I love how the bridge goes to C. So that's right basically here. All right, I hear, this is the third time you've gone to that C chord, right? So you go to the C chord. Now here's the C, coming back to D, to G. Fine. And then again to D, to G. I want an F. I want G7. Something like this. I'll start at the beginning of the bridge so you can hear it in context. Whoa, what did I do? I left, this guy's still an F natural sharp. And actually, I think I would bring it in earlier. I would bring it in the piano part, perhaps there. So I got to do it again. All right, so the idea is I'm tonicizing the C chord, giving it its own secondary dominant, G7, the 5 chord in the key of C. You can tonicize any chord you want, and in a lot of music it makes sense to do like in jazz, we tonicize lots of chords. We give them those secondary dominants like that. In a piece like this, you want to be much more judicious about how much of that you do. But to me, that was the spot. Right? That was the spot, the third phrase, the third repetition of that little melody in there. Now here, the same thing could happen. So here we have that approach to E minor that, when it happened in the previous section is the spot where I was trying to make that into a B chord, right? It's the same chord progression that we have here. Here, now there is no D natural in the melody to prevent me from making this be an actual D sharp, so that I'm creating a D sharp diminished chord. Let's hear that. Yeah, I like that. And then, if I want the B also, I can have it. So that is another example of a tonicization. I'm creating the sound of a B major chord, or a B7 chord, I should say, or a D sharp diminished chord. Either of those chords would make sense to tonicize E minor. B7 is 5-1 in E minor. D sharp diminished is 7-1 in E minor. So there was an opportunity for just that little bit of this sound. And I say in jazz we do it all the time, but this sound isn't from jazz. This sound is from Bach. Well, it predates Bach. I guarantee this progression right there, Bach would have written this way also. So anyhow, that's something to consider, that when you're approaching that D minor, sometimes you could approach it with just a plain D chord, but in the places where you want to get a little extra mileage out of it, you could do that. So Sam was asking about a G with an F sharp in the bass. Presumably here, if this is what you mean here, G with F sharp in the bass, yeah, that's also possible. Or actually either of those places, it could be. I guess you were probably talking more of this because it fits the melody better here. So yeah, if we call this G a G major chord with F sharp in the bass, it's okay. I'm not crazy about that sound unless I'm feeling it. That's all I can say. That sound of the major chord bass line going down to that seventh like that. Now on minor chords going out, that's a really cool thing. For some reason the major chord sound doesn't do it for me so much. It could, depending on what's in the melody. If the melody was the fifth of the chord, yeah, I don't know. I can't explain how I know when it's going to feel right to me. I would just say I had a sense that it wasn't there. So in any case, yeah, I think so much about this piece is really working well, exactly saying the things it needs to be saying. Those were just a couple small changes. By the way, this boop, 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 boop. I like that bass line. But I would say there's probably no reason for this guy to be a tenth, especially because the E was in the melody already. I would probably have made this one an octave too. I love tenths. I love rocking tenths like that. But if given that the third was already in the melody, I didn't need to hear it again in the bass. So in a different context, like right here, having G, B, like that, that would have been perhaps nice to help fill in that G chord. Here, I don't feel like the E really helped as much. It's not filling in the chord because we already have that note. But yeah, I'm thinking about things like that often. If I've only got a couple notes to work with, making sure that they actually fill out the chord the way I want. Okay, so yeah, just really, really nice stuff in here, and I look forward to seeing, how you end up finishing it. I mean, it's largely done in a lot of ways. I think, maybe just dealing with a few details of how you want it presented, whether you are going to literally have, 4 parts, that's just 2 parts doubled. If you really mean for that third part to just enter every once in a while, or if you eventually want full 3-part harmony, that could be the subject of another discussion. Okay, so thanks a lot, Joanne. I really enjoyed listening to this piece and talking about it. I want to conclude by returning to another piece of Colleen's, but now I've lost where it is. Yes, it's really cool ragtime thing that she put together here. That is, well, you'll hear it in a second. I think the title gives you an idea of what to expect. Let's hear. There we go. And I noticed, by the way, Colleen, when you first had it, you didn't have the second ending in there, and now it is. At least I don't think it was. Really, really nice. This is fun. I like pieces like this. It's like, you know, there's a humor element to the starting off with the entertainer and having very much of the entertainer feel, but then having a melody that is more, and chord progression that is taken from Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace, da 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 da, right? So it's borrowing from Amazing Grace while also incorporating bits of the entertainer, more than bits of it. It's like the whole entertainer framework with harmony and melody taken more from Amazing Grace. So it's just really fun. And yeah, it works incredibly well. I'm going to give you a couple little pointers here. One is, I see you wrote the word tremolo here. By the way, I'm pretty sure it's tremolo, not tremelo, as opposed to Carmelo Anthony, who you might be familiar with, perhaps, if you follow sports at all. The tremolo, there's a whole palette here for tremolo. Where did it go? It's in there somewhere. Here it is. So the way tremolo works is, instead of writing the chord like this, what we do is I'm going to write 2 eighth notes. I'm going to write the bottom eighth note and then the top eighth note. And then I'm going to select the bottom note and use one of these symbols here, the one that doesn't have a stem through it. That indicates that it's actually going to appear between the 2 notes. So I'm going to use the one with 3 strokes, and you get this. Let's hear that. Now, realistically, that's how I would write it, with only 3 strokes, but it's disappointing that it didn't play it faster. So, okay, I'll write it with 4 strokes. So that's how you get that sound, just in case you are wondering. Yeah. Repeats. Yeah, so you got it. All right, good. So there you go. So, yeah, there's only a few things musically that I mean, there's a lot of really nice things. I mean, the way this, the way that the left hand works is really nice. Now, this shouldn't be spelled A flat. That should be spelled G sharp. Whoops. J, by the way, respells, because it's still that same chord. It's still that E chord. Now, I'm a little surprised by the return to the 1 chord there. I feel like I don't know what you were working from that made you want to come back to the 1 chord. I guess maybe I'll try to get inside your brain a little bit. The fact that you spelled it as A flat, I guess you're thinking about B diminished and thinking B diminished wants to come back to C. I cannot argue that point, but you've led me to expect A minor here. And I don't get the A minor. And I want to hear an A minor, so I want to try it, an A minor. So hearing an A minor, it gives me more of what I expect after the C. But there's another thing that I could possibly expect. There's a chord progression that you're probably familiar with from a few different songs that goes 1 and then major 3 and then 4. Someday My Prince Will Come is a classic example that's often played that way. I'm trying to think of this. There's another like Fats Waller tune or something like that. It's not Ain't Misbehavin'. I can't. I'm drawing a blank. But something that goes basically C, E7 to F. So I want to try an F chord also and see what that sounds like. Right? And that's a way Amazing Grace might often be done also. Amazing Grace could be done with either an E chord or with a C7 chord. But I'm going to F chord, right? So that's why I'm expecting that F, because I know often Amazing Grace is done that way. So I thought that would have been either the A minor or the F might have been more interesting than the C. I guess what happens is Entertainer comes back to C, but it comes back to C in second inversion if I'm remembering correctly. If I'm remembering correctly, see, Buddha do da Buddha Buddha bum. There would have been a G in the bass there, yeah. So it would have been a C chord in second inversion, and the E chord wouldn't have led there. So I would be looking at a chord more like this, and I think it actually fits. Yeah, because it also gives you that nice motion here of F and then F sharp diminished. So it's F, F sharp, G. And even though you've got a G in the melody, I might have put the G in the bass here and the F sharp in the bass there. And then maybe put a B in the bass there. So I get the smoother bass line. And what I might do, well, here, let me show you something. So I like to hear the bum, bum, bum. We don't always get that luxury in playing ragtime or stride piano that the bass line makes the same sort of sense, but I often like to try to visualize it that way. See a separate bass line and chord part. And so here's the other thing. You've already sounded the E here, and then so you go to another bass note here, and then you have to leap down to that F. Not that you had an F, you had a C. But here's how I might solve that problem. I might put a G sharp at the beginning of the measure, and then the E at the end of the measure, and I'm going to go back to calling that G sharp, so that I get bum, bum, bum. I'm singing it wrong. Bum, bum, ba, So. And now the bass line is a little more clear. There's also a thing you can do when you want to. It's another way of solving problems like this and creating interest at the same time. So what it's going to be is I'm going to reverse these two. So if you're in note input mode and you have two chords of the same duration, shift left will reverse them. It only works in note input mode only if the chords are of the same duration. And then it doesn't actually help me here. I don't know why I did it, but it's fun anyhow. So I'm going to change this to an A, and then that one be the G sharp, so that I have something actually change here. So you'll recognize this sound. It's not the right sound for here, but it is a nice trick. right? Turning the pattern around every once in a while, not always having the bass note on the beat, but occasionally putting the chord on the beat and then bringing the bass note down after. Sometimes you do it just for variety. Sometimes you do it though because it allows the bass note connect a little better if you do that. So it's not really actually relevant here, but I thought of it. So by the way, speaking of the bass line here, this is Scott Joplin's bass line, right? But it's a great example of it because you get to really hear that C, B flat, A to A flat to G. By the way, I'm going to do something right now because it came up recently. Dave, you were talking about augmented sixth chords. This minor 4 chord, I love minor 4 chords, but minor 4 chord is only a half step away from being an augmented sixth chord. Now it's an augmented sixth chord. I want to hear this. So this sound is the augmented sixth chord. It's basically an A flat 7 chord, in this case with D in the melody. So it's a French augmented sixth, otherwise known as A flat 7 sharp 11. It's not what Scott Joplin wrote, but it is a commonly used chord in this context. Beethoven loved that chord, used it all the time. It's got some great drama to it. And so anyhow, it's another chord that works in that harmonic context. So anyhow, really, really nice piece here, and I like what you're doing with it. I like what you've done with it, and by all means, think about writing the next strain to it. It'd be really fun to hear maybe some other song worked into the next strain. So I'm going to undo all these changes because it's really fine as it was, and I didn't want to accidentally mess things up, but I do need to be on my way, and I'm sure you all have other things to be getting to as well. So I want to thank everyone for being here for the Music Masterclass today. We do this every Thursday, and I don't know about you, but I have a lot of fun doing this, looking at people's music and looking at what makes it tick and see if a couple places we can find other ways to make it tick. And by all means, check out the pinned link at the top. This service is brought to you by the Mastering MuseScore School, where I have my MuseScore course, my basic theory course, harmony course, and really, really soon, 2 weeks from now, you'll be hearing about the counterpoint course. So thanks, everyone, and keep submitting music. Look forward to what people come up with for next time. Maybe I'll come up with some sort of challenge to get going when I launch the counterpoint course. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Joanne. Thanks, Colleen, for the music. And I will see you all next time.